Hey, how are you? My name is Ben, and I'm a movie buff. If you're like me, you've probably seen your fair share of horror films. I love horror as a genre, and it's interesting to see the different ways that horror films try to scare us. We all know that jump scares are a very popular way to scare audiences for a moment, but there are other techniques that are possibly more effective at scaring the audience for a longer time. I thought it'd be fun to talk about 4 different approaches to scaring moviegoers and look at their strengths and weaknesses. After discussing them all, I'll try and figure out which one is the most effective at terrifying people. Keep in mind that I'm not talking about every single tactic, but when I thought of the most common ways we are scared, these 4 are the first ones that resonated with me the most. First up, the jump scare. Even if you don't watch horror movies, you've seen at least one jump scare in your life. That's how popular this technique is of scaring people. You know the drill. A character is by themselves, they hear a noise, they get closer and closer to the source of the noise, and whether it's early, on time, or a little delayed, boom! Jump scare. So we all know what this is, but what's the main strength of this technique? If it's done well, the viewer will be on the edge in the lead up of the scare and then jump when the loud noise or sudden sight appears. There are lots of good jump scares out there, but there is one movie where I reacted to every single jump scare, and that is A Quiet Place. Now, I know not every single movie can do this, but the filmmakers found an effective way to play with sound so we would get accustomed to only hearing quieter noises for about 5 to 10 minutes at a time before being surprised by a loud sound. Even if we saw it coming, it still scares us. What's the main weakness of a jump scare? I think because of how often they are utilized in horror films. They are typically predictable. Like I said earlier, sometimes a jump scare can happen earlier, or on time, or late to try and throw you off. But if you've seen many jump scares, like I have, you've become a bit desensitized to them. It doesn't help when a movie over-relies on jump scares, so even if the first few scare you, the rest become less effective as the movie continues. I don't jump at most of these scares because a lot of them are set in a routine. Even the variations of this routine are still not too far from the basic beat of how a jump scare works. The next technique is scaring people with disgust. Slashers and torture films proudly wear this technique on their sleeve. Most horror films are known for their violence and contain some of the most graphic acts of violence I've ever seen. If it's a slasher, someone will get their limb chopped off in gory detail, or if it's a torture film, we'll have to watch in sickening detail as the victim is tortured in many different ways. This is the kind of scare technique that makes you sick to your stomach. I would argue that the strength here is the ability to display some truly realistic-looking practical effects that fool your eyes into believing what you are seeing to be completely real. I've seen some practical effects that look pretty fake, and therefore I don't feel that disgusted. But when I watch movies like Saw or the Evil Dead reboot from 2013, they have some of the most bloody, violent effects that had me squirming in my seat. I think there's an art to showing off this kind of disgust in a horror movie. How clearly should the audience see it? How long should we see it for? How much blood? What kind of noises should we hear? How should the character react to their injury? I think both movies above do a good job by playing around with these factors. The weakness of disgust is that sometimes it can be relied upon too often. It takes a great amount of skill to find the best ways to truly horrify your audience throughout your film. Disgust can feel pretty cheap if that's your primary approach to scaring the viewer. For example, the first Saw film knew when to show violence and when to let the audience imagine it. That was scary. The idea of having people put into horrific traps because they didn't value their lives was also something that terrified me the first time I watched it. But the sequels focused a little too much on sick and twisted ways of torturing and killing people. Some of it was scary, but I left most of the sequels feeling just grossed out. That might be part of feeling scared, but it's not the only part. The third technique is scaring people with real-life problems. This approach is basically a psychological one. It's not as sudden as a jump scare or graphic as discussed, but it seems to be one that is gradual. It can get under your skin more and more as the story continues. Most horror stories take place in a reality similar to ours, with people that are similar to us or someone we know. Maybe there's a character who's struggling with some form of addiction. Maybe there's a character who has trauma. These characters I just described all come from an amazing show called The Haunting of Hill House. What makes this horror show brilliant is that there are some jump scares and moments of disgust, but the real horror I felt came from the lives of these characters who all had different problems that they couldn't really escape. While there are supernatural elements to this show, every character goes through an experience that in some way is relatable. It's scary because there are many people who are going through similar things right now. It isn't something you simply stop feeling or doing. It could be with you for the rest of your life. The weakness of using real-life problems is that depending on your experiences and those of the characters you are watching, you might not feel anything. If a teenager was watching this show, they might not feel any fear while trying to relate to these adult characters. If they haven't had any experience with trauma or addiction, directly or indirectly, it's possible they may only sympathize, not empathize with the characters. It really depends on the person who is watching your show. But for every young person watching, there is usually someone older, someone who has gone through more life experiences. The last approach is using your own imagination. There are many horror films that show you in explicit detail what is going on, what the monster looks like, or what a kill or torture scene looks like. But filmmakers should never underestimate the value of the audience's imagination. This technique is in the less is more category. You give the audience a hint of the terror that they are about to experience, and instead of showing it clearly, you let them use their imagination for a while. Alien makes good use of this. If you look at the xenomorph and then look at the ship that it is currently running loose on, you get the feeling that the monster could literally be anywhere, hiding, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But I think the most recent prime example of this approach has to go to the 2020 horror movie, The Invisible Man. The movie uses the three approaches that I mentioned earlier in this video, but what the audience doesn't see is certainly more scary than what we do see. There are so many wide shots in this film that force you to look around at the space the characters are inhabiting. We can't help but look at the empty background, wondering if he is there. It doesn't take long before we are paranoid like the main character. And that's good horror. While I'd like to think my imagination is the perfect kind to be used during a horror film, I'd guess that there are some people who don't have a vibrant imagination. A movie like The Invisible Man might not scare them if they can't play along. Imagine if you had never seen a monster before, like Freddy Krueger. Then someone asks you to imagine a man who had his whole body scarred from being burned alive and also has gloved knives. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could conjure up a more terrifying image than this one here. It's possible that some people weren't scared by the Invisible Man because they had to use their imagination for most of the movie. Alright, I've talked about 4 different techniques on scaring people. Which one is the most effective? I know this may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think all of them can be very effective when combined together. A movie like Alien is scary because of its masterful jump scares, but it can also be scary due to its violence, the nightmarish design of the xenomorph, and the fact that it can blend in well to the design of the ship. I didn't even talk about sound and music. These both can add a haunting atmosphere to any given movie. If you look at some of the best horror films ever made, you'll notice that they tend to be scary not just because of one approach, but of several. Some of which I discussed, others I didn't get to. As I mentioned earlier, each scare tactic can lose their effectiveness if they're used too much in a movie. But if you skillfully weave different ways of terrifying the audience, that's when you have something special. So thank you so much, guys, for watching this video. I'd like to thank Dan, who suggested that I do a nice discussion on horror. Please comment and like this video, share it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.